Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rick Hamilton, Chief Technology Officer for the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. Today and tomorrow, we're going to be excited to hear about from a number of different experts on a timely and important topic, navigating AI ML, or artificial intelligence and machine learning integration into medical devices. So before we get started, a few technical items. If your connection is lost, please simply log in again using your registration link. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll receive a link to the event recording as well. With that, I'd like to introduce our day one speakers. First up, we'll have Bradley Merrill Thompson, attorney for Epstein Baker Green. Immediately following him will be Michael Zagorski, strategic consultant for EBG Advisors. They'll be leading a discussion on FDA regulatory needs for AI/ML in medical devices, and we'll have a brief Q&A at the end of their presentation. After that Q&A, we'll turn it over to Nathan Evans, Head of Intellectual Property for Woods Rogers, who will speak on a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and that is patent innovations implementing AI/ML technology in healthcare. Likewise, Nathan will save time at the end of his talk for Q&A before today's sessions conclude. If you have questions today, I would ask you to please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to our first two speakers, Brad Thompson and Michael Zagorski. Brad?
Well, thanks so much, Rick. I'm pleased to be here today, and the general order of things is that I'm going to provide sort of an overview of the FDA requirements, and I'm going to do a little bit deeper dive into a couple areas, and then Mike, who is a much more interesting speaker, will speak after me. So specifically, I'm going to cover what does FDA regulate. It's our understanding that many of you are developing various applications in AI, and we'll go through a few that I understand you're developing. And there will be a question with some of them as to whether FDA even regulates them or not. So I want to cover that right off the bat. Then I'm going to give an overview of how FDA currently is regulating AI, talk a little bit about the future. And then we're going to get into a topic that's really a hot topic this year with FDA and with others, bias, and their concerns about bias in these algorithms. And we'll talk about, at the end, a couple of new laws very briefly, because it's sort of outside the scope. But you need to understand what your customers are facing in the way of legal requirements associated with the use of these products. Let's start with what FDA regulates. These are the case studies that I got from Rick and others, and they gave me more detail, but I kind of summarized them here and put them into three buckets. A wide variety of tools for selecting the right patients for a certain procedure, tools for planning how to do that procedure, and then tools for determining after the treatment whether there's follow-on treatment or other interventions that would be appropriate. I'm not going to go into detail here because obviously you're producing a wide variety of these tools. So what I really want to do is have clear in my mind the general types of things you're doing so that we can talk about how the FDA requirements apply to those elements. So the question of which ones get regulated is typically under this rubric of clinical decision support at FDA. They have a guidance that was finalized in 2022 that interpreted a statute from 2016, 8 years earlier. And that statute, the language is pretty much here on your screen. I've included the pertinent language here. And those bracketed information things on the left-hand side are simply my shorthand for how I refer to the four different requirements. To be completely honest, I was involved in the negotiation of this legislative language, representing the industry, working directly with the staff at Senators Bennett and Hatch, who were the sponsors of this legislation. And FDA was directly involved. And so it was a group discussion about what to do. And FDA was very insistent on the first of these requirements, which are that any software that does image or signal analysis remain regulated. I say remain because FDA had been regulating artificial intelligence used to analyze radiological images for, at that point, 20 years, since the late 1990s. So they wanted to make it clear that those things, if you're using a tool that analyzes an image or a signal, and signal is a pretty vague term, but an FDA interprets it expansively. But if you're doing those things, FDA regulates it. But you're outside of FDA regulation if the next 2, 3, and 4 requirements are met. The inputs are patient medical information, a very generic statement. That's the statutory language. The outputs are recommendations to healthcare providers. So if it were directed at a patient or a consumer, it wouldn't be excluded. And you do it with appropriate transparency so that the user understands the basis for the recommendation and doesn't need to rely on the recommendation because they can bring their own judgment to bear. If you do those three things, in theory, FDA will not regulate your software. Well, I say in theory because the FDA guidance from 2022 really expanded FDA's jurisdiction in ways beyond the statutory language. And so, for example, with regard to the inputs, FDA said the inputs have to be well accepted. They have to be things that you would see two doctors talking about when they're trying to make a certain type of decision. Their theory is that this was not meant to cover novel artificial intelligence applications. There's nothing in the legislative language to suggest that, but that is FDA's view. Second, the outputs have to be multiple. FDA's argument is if the language says this is the right answer, then it's being directive as opposed to simply making a recommendation. Again, no language in the legislation that would support that. When you provide those multiple answers, you're not allowed to rank them. If you want to be unregulated, you can't rank them from most likely, second most likely, third most likely, because if you do, again, you're telling them what to do in FDA's eyes. And there can't be any time pressure. You have to be able to sort of think and cogitate and so forth about what the algorithm is telling you. Examples that they gave of language or use cases that would be regulated includes software that says that a specific patient may exhibit signs of a disease or condition. Wow, that wipes out a whole bunch of devices which I would have otherwise thought would be unregulated. Or identifies a risk probability or risk score for a specific disease or condition, another example of what FDA said was regulated. FDA also imposed very stringent requirements for transparency and explainability. An awful lot of people felt that this was unlawful, that this was beyond the statute. And so I filed a citizens petition in February of last year. A law professor who I know, a friend of mine, filed one in May, I think it was, of last year. And in April of this year, Senator Cassidy sent a letter saying, I think this guidance is unlawful. I'd like you to answer some questions. All that said, it is still the guidance that's sitting there. It's still what companies are trying to comply with. And FDA has shown no willingness to back off. So in that same guidance, they included some examples, lots of examples to be clear, and I just included two here that seem somewhat relevant. One was creating an individual treatment plan, which is reminiscent of what I was being told some of you are thinking about. And the other that says that it's regulated if it includes a list of follow-on options for the healthcare professional to pursue. These are just general examples. They included, I don't know, 30 or 40 of them, quite a few. And you sort of need to read those for context as to what FDA is trying to do. So let's talk about FDA's current approach to AI. One of the things that you immediately recognize when you dive into this area is that the vast majority of applications over the last 20-some years are in radiology, most of them in reading medical images. So in terms of submissions, it's closing in on 800, it looks like, just under 800 radiology submissions, and it drops off obviously radically after that. If you just look at the left-hand side, you'd think, wow, it's really growing, but the vast majority obviously are still radiology. I converted this, the government has a fiscal year that starts October 1st. I converted it to calendar year to make it more meaningful, and I included the first quarter of this calendar year, and you can see they've got some ways to go for 2024. So I took radiology out of it, the image reading programs out of it, just to see what was left. And the trend upward is still there, although during the pandemic years it was low, and you can excuse that based on the pandemic, but it looks like it's sort of picking up again. And the top application is computer diagnosis, and this is standalone software. There's 17 of them. Standalone software that's used to help diagnose patients what they might have. Most of the time, AI gets regulated as an accessory to a device if it's informing how that device is to be used. So a lot of your products, your AI products, would be probably regulated as accessories. So the way FDA operates, as you probably know, is wherever technology hit first, whatever therapeutic area, that's where they develop their guidance first, and they kind of stick with that. So we're going to be talking about this, and this is basically Mike's presentation, talking about what FDA specifically requires to get, a 510(k), for example, or to get a clinical trial up and running for an AI application. But it's all based on the radiology guidance that is now, the most recent drafts are a couple years old. Most of you are veterans, I suspect, of FDA, and you already know this, but and an awful lot of products, obviously, the vast majority are cleared through 510(k). And if you look at the data, and I have this segmented by 5 years because that's the cycle that we're under for the user fee analysis. The line down there, sort of fourth from the bottom, says rate of SE decisions. That's the rate of positive decisions. And you can see that folks that file 510(k)s do very well, 96, 97, 98% likelihood. Unfortunately, in this space, FDA is pushing more and more companies with novel AI to do de novos, and that's horrible news. If you look at that same rate, the rate of granted decisions, all of a sudden from 98%, we're down to 44%, 45%, 50%, 52% for a high, and then most recently 43.9%. All of a sudden, it's a very different ballgame. And if you've ever done a de novo, you know that they're awful. The standard is different. It has to be safe and effective, which is a more general standard as opposed to proving that you're substantially equivalent to something already on the market. They take longer to review, much longer. The 90 and 150 days are deceiving. I put question marks there because that's their goal, but in reality, they exceed those by quite a bit. There's a lack of guidance. You typically have a guidance document if it's in the 510(k) realm. You don't for de novo. By definition, you only have a procedural guidance. And the clinical trials that they require are very different. So if they try to push you in the direction of a de novo, my advice is try and resist as best you can. So where are they going with this? Well, the future is developing more specific guidance for AI. So for example, 3 years ago, they developed these good machine learning practices. They did it in partnership with Canada and the UK, but it's a very general document. The whole thing is like 1 page long, and it has sort of very high level platitudes, but they're important platitudes about things like separating your training data from your tuning data and so forth, which are all good practices. They're right practices, but there isn't any real description or explanation about what these things are. And I asked at a conference where FDA was talking about this if they plan to create a regulation, and they said no. But I think more recently they're talking about maybe doing a guidance document that addresses some of these topics. In addition, you have this topic of predetermined change controls, which applies to all medical devices now, but it was really created in the context of AI about 4 or 5 years ago. Some innovative companies that were pursuing clearance proposed these to allow their AI to evolve as it went along. And so they came up with this framework. Congress enacted it in late December. It was right before January 1st of 2022. Then FDA last year came out with a guidance document, and Mike's going to talk a little bit more about that, I think, as well. If any of you are thinking of making your AI autonomous, where it makes some decision, in effect, doesn't have to be a final decision, but some decision without a human in the loop, and more folks are developing these things, then you have a whole different set of issues. I shouldn't say different, but a whole more rigorous set of issues that you have to deal with. And I would suggest that you read the transcript, which is on the FDA website from this 2020 meeting. It's one of the last meetings I attended before the pandemic shut everything down. And they talk about the fact that they need much more data because they need the edge cases covered if there's going to be any degree of autonomy. And you're all familiar, there are degrees of autonomy, degrees by which you let the AI proceed without human guidance. And they want a lot more post-market vigilance for that as well. So let's talk about kind of the second topic, which is discrimination in healthcare. And this is kind of one of the more, I'll say, unique aspects of AI regulation. Because if you're developing a scalpel or any number of things, there isn't an issue about whether they discriminate or not. There is an issue in the context of a recommendation, whether autonomous or not, a recommendation that may be biased in some particular direction or not. And a lot of you, I suspect, are scientists or maybe business people, but probably scientists. And your initial reaction is, well, this doesn't apply to me because, we're scientists and we use science, we use data, we use hard data. How on earth can this be a factor? My job in the next 10 minutes is to convince you that it's actually very common in many of these circumstances. So let's start with the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story is that our health outcomes depend on much more than just the medical care we receive. If you look at this chart, which is adopted by the AMA, only about 11% of the factors that determine the ultimate health outcomes are the medical care that we receive. What else? Well, individual behavior. If you drink too much, if you take illegal drugs, if you eat too much, if you do any number of things, it can substantially injure your health. Your social circumstances, what kind of housing you live in, I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Who you are genetically and biologically. Personalized medicine now is well established. We are all different. We all react differently to treatments. And so our genetic makeup is recognized as a huge determinant of likely outcomes. So if you want to predict what will happen to Brad Thompson, you need more information. The social determinants are particularly well recognized these days. We understand that the home in which people lives, whether it's full of mold or whatever, the diet that they eat and they can afford to eat, the economic stability and how reliable their access is to health care, what stress they're under, all of these things typically influence a wide range of diseases. Why am I going through all of this? Your data scientists will want as much information as they can get on more than just the clinical, that 11%, the clinical care that they're receiving, because you want them to produce accurate predictions. And the only way to get an accurate prediction is to go beyond the medical care that they're receiving. Going beyond the medical care they're receiving is what creates the opportunity for discrimination. I'll talk more about what I mean by that term. And sometimes it's unavoidable. Remember, in discrimination law, age, sex, disability, these are all common bases for discrimination, and yet they're things that absolutely have to be included in many cases in a clinical algorithm. It would be malpractice not to include age, sex, disability in many clinical applications. So the information is there. In fact, it has to be there, and that's what creates the tension. So let me talk a little bit more about discrimination. You might be putting on your history hat or your social scientist hat and remembering, discrimination that's caused by the evil in our hearts, by prejudice, by bigotry, and so forth. And that's a piece of it, but it's a very small piece of it, actually. The majority of the discrimination that we're talking about is bias that is an artifact of math. It is not related to the evil wellspring that is in all people. All people have to some degree of tendency to be biased in their treatment of other people. But that is not the root cause of a lot of the bias that we're going to be talking about. A lot of what we're going to be talking about is harmful statistical bias that's the result of, I'll say it again, math. For example, the early facial recognition software was widely recognized as about 98% effective at identifying white men. It did very well. And then when it was tested on Black women and measured that accuracy, it turned out to be only 70% accurate for Black women. No evil intent there, no prejudice on the part of the people who developed that algorithm. They just didn't have as much data to train on Black women, so the algorithm didn't do as well in recognizing Black women. If you want to dive into this topic, I just want to note that I wrote an article about a year ago where I did a case study on sepsis. And I picked sepsis because it's sort of benign and clinical, and you wouldn't expect discrimination to occur in a sepsis algorithm. But I teased it apart to show lots of different causes of algorithms. So if you like to read, this would be an article that you could read. But I'll give you sort of some of the takeaways in this presentation. The first issue is, well, how does an algorithm even know this sensitive information? And I've already said sometimes we tell it the information. Sometimes we say what the sex is, what the age is, what the disability is. But more often, the algorithm infers it as a proxy. And the government is squarely focused on this idea of proxy, of bias by proxy. You probably all know that mathematically we can predict a person's race pretty easily by zip code. Not with 100% accuracy. I forget what the accuracy is, but 80% roughly accuracy. If you tell me a person's zip code, I can predict what race they are. Did you know, maybe you did, that if you give me 6 vital signs, I can predict race with about the same accuracy, about 80% accuracy? 6 common vital signs. Why? Because of all that stuff I just covered, all the social determinants of health, the genetic piece, all of that stuff means that if you give me 6 vital signs with 80% accuracy, I can tell you what race you are. It would be even stronger if you gave me genetics, although there's actually less genetic variance sometimes between race than you would think, and social determinants of health. I'm just talking right here, the 80% just relates to 6 vital signs. So I'm going to go through very quickly 4 examples of how bias seeps into what might otherwise appear to be scientific algorithms. I'll talk about sample bias. I'll talk about man-made but accidental programming bias. I'll talk about bias that's nothing more than a mathematical artifact from volume. And then I'll finally end up with historical human bias that's more akin to what we're accustomed to when we talk about discrimination. Let's talk about sample bias, sometimes population bias, whatever you want to call it. But the important thing to recognize is that there is variation across people. And if you take 2 variables, age and sex, both of which are regulated variables, blood pressure changes rather dramatically across sex and age. And so if you're dealing with that, if your data set is impregnated with that, you have 2 options. You can ignore it or you can embrace it. If you ignore it, you lose accuracy because you have to take all of this and you just average it. And you come up with one average and you apply it to a new person based on the average when in fact there's wide variability in the data. So you lose accuracy. If you instead embrace it and label as man, woman, or age, then you're specifically programming your algorithm with those sensitive factors. But the other thing to remember is that all data sets are tilted in one direction or another. All data sets are. Every data set I've seen, I should say. So for example, I'll take a gross example. If you're working in Medicare data, it's biased. It's biased towards age. If nothing else, it's biased dramatically towards age. So if you take data from a Medicare data set and you use it in Provo, Utah, little known fact, the youngest city in America, it'll be wildly off in terms of accuracy. I don't know if they count every Brigham Young student there as a full-time resident. I don't know why, but you can imagine a lot more subtle variations based on certain private insurance data or other data that's taken from one community and applied to another community. If you're just taking averages from one to another, if the underlying populations are different, your results will be biased. There's also accidental bias, and I had to start with this example from only a month or 2 ago, where Google released Gemini, and there was the headline, that if you asked it about Nazis, pictures of Nazis, it came up with this very inclusive set of Nazis, not historically accurate, but inclusive, because the programmers who designed the product thought, let's make it inclusive. Let's force it to be inclusive. But the problem is, then the algorithm applied that to everything, even when it wasn't appropriate. Does that happen in healthcare? It absolutely happens in healthcare. And I've included 2 well-known examples here. One is the GFT rate, which was an instance of where clinicians who developed this product gave a boost to the scores of Black people because they thought there was a difference between Black and white in this. This is a kidney disease rating. They gave them a boost because they thought there were differences. Well, it turns out they were using sort of a blunt instrument when they needed a more nuanced, because some Blacks, it was true, some Blacks it was not. And overall, it had tremendous negative impact on Blacks when they made that adjustment. An article that was in JAMA, an article just 2 weeks ago, May 19, for lung evaluations using a spirometer. Very much the same thing. There was a boost given to Black people, their scores, and it wasn't justified. And the problem with doing that is you miss treatment, people who needed treatment. From a disability standpoint of getting VA benefits, there's like $1 billion at play here if you correct that, because there should be more people getting benefits than who currently are. Data quantity bias. This is a math bias, right? So I start with a simple notion that machines are actually not nearly as smart as people. These are my grandkids, and Blair is 2, and Connor is 3. And if you look closely, you will see that Connor has his shoes on the wrong feet. You can tell that kid 50 times how to pick the right pair of shoes or how to put them on the right feet, and he just won't get it. So if I sat down with them and I showed them pictures of dogs and cats, if you showed Blair about 10 photos, dogs and cats, she'd by the end of that pretty much be able to say what the 11th photo was, whether it was a dog or cat. Connor might take 20. The typical convolutional neural network, this data might be a little bit outdated, but the old rule of thumb was you need about 5,000 images for a CNN to accurately predict what it was looking at. I think the number's lower now, but the point is computers are not smarter. They succeed ultimately because they can read quickly and they don't get tired and they can read a ton, but you have to have the data to feed them. So if you take an example, take Thompson's disease that afflicts 1 out of 10,000 people. If I go and I find the perfect data set, and by perfect I mean it absolutely reflects the proportions in the US of the different races, for example, and you use that data set, 100,000 images, you'd have about 75,000 images of white people, you'd have about 2,000 images of Pacific Islanders, just because that is the US proportion of Pacific Islanders. That is not going to be enough data to do well for Pacific Islanders. I've added an added feature here, 1 out of 10,000, which means with 2,000 images, you likely wouldn't even have a single positive. And so when it comes to false positives, it would be very high. So the point is, you actually cannot take representative data and use it. You need to boost the participation of the smaller numerically minority participants in it in order to get anywhere near comparable accuracy, again, just based on the math of it and the ability of the algorithm to learn. Let's talk about the historical bias. It is a fact of life that there has been bigotry in the US. There's no other way to describe it. And healthcare is very much in line with the rest of society. Doctors, it turns out, are human. They have the same biases that any human has. So you have ageism, you have sexism toward patients, you have racism toward patients. Well documented. I just included a few links here. If you're not convinced, I could give you dozens more. And so sometimes we program with this sensitive information. Sometimes we do not program with the sensitive information. But the corpus of information on which these algorithms are trained is very often containing biased data. For example, I noticed that a few applications might contemplate the use of physician notes. Physician notes are well understood to be biased. For example, when Black people report pain to physicians, they often get, if not dismissed, downgraded in what they're describing vis-a-vis white people, and therefore the corresponding treatment is influenced by that subjective lowering of the pain being reported. So if your algorithm is looking at physician notes, it's going to pick up on that same bias that's in those notes. And then you also have the structural bias in terms of access, that different races have had different access to private pay policies. Medicaid is not evenly dispersed across all races and sexes and so forth. So all of these underlying data sets have the structural bias that causes them to have higher numbers of some and not others. And if you don't account for that, your algorithm will be biased. So then you layer on this generative AI stuff, and it just makes it 10 times more complicated. And so this is a study that was done by the person down below, Kiernan Snyder, who just changed the word Harvard to Howard in a query that they made to ChatGPT. And you can see the difference in the output. And they did it multiple times. That's where these percentages come from. In terms of, analytical skills favor Harvard, all the way down to passion for diversity inclusion, which favors Howard. Just out of personal interest, I typed in University, Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and the top word I got was corn. Stupid algorithm. The magnitude of this is not trivial, all right? You might think that I'm talking about very small issues. They are not. Statistically, they are not. These things affect millions of people. It's obviously a projection because not all algorithms have been evaluated. In fact, very few have. So they took the ones that they evaluated and they extrapolated to ones that they didn't evaluate. So there's all sorts of subjectivity in this study. But the fact of the matter is, it's well understood to be quite frequent. So what does FDA think about this? Well, number one, you have to start with the fact that the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act does not call out particular classes to protect. It doesn't say age, sex, disability, and so forth, like many of the employment statutes do. So, for example, you have to think about health disparities, and it's things like socioeconomic status and geographic location have been a huge source of discrimination in the past. The rural poor have had far less access to medical care, and their lives are very different. So their biology, because of diet and the social determinants of health, is very different. So you have to broaden your lens beyond just looking at race and the other things that are so commonly identified. And FDA is just saying flat out, bias will not be accepted. So when you go through the review process at FDA, they will ask you all sorts of questions about how you measured certain things in the training data set, how you compared them to the ultimate intended use that you apply, what you've done to evaluate for the potential of bias. All of these things now are very much front and center in FDA reviews. I also want you to know just what your customers are facing. There's a brand new, literally, May 6th it was published, regulation from the Office of Civil Rights at HHS telling your users that they will now be on the hook legally if the algorithms they use, I highlighted the word use, discriminate. And they come up with a new term. I wish they would stop doing that. But patient care decision support tools, which is basically the same as clinical decision support, other than the fact that they make it clear that it even includes non-automated tools. If they use a slide ruler or something, I don't know. But all of that stuff is going to be regulated in their use. So what are they going to do? They are required to work with you, the developer, to identify risk because they know how they're going to use it on their population. So they need to make sure that you trained it on a population that is comparable to the actual population they want to use it on, and they're on the hook. So they're going to be asking you for all sorts of information in order to comply with this law because they have to take reasonable steps to mitigate the risk. The trigger is if they know or should know that there might be discrimination, which is a pretty low standard because they should know that there is a risk of discrimination in an awful lot of places, and they have to scan all this literature and so forth in order to find out. And then if they find it, they have to mitigate it. So let's talk just very briefly about ONC. This is well beyond the scope of today's presentation, but they too have a hand in this, and they've worked with FDA so that if you supply your software through the electronic health record, through the certified electronic health record, you will be obliged to tell your customers a lot of information about what you have done in order to identify and fix or mitigate bias. For predictive DSIs, which are most of the machine learning applications, there'll be 31 so-called source attributes. And that's where you have to show information, attributes about your product that will allow them to make sure that you've been diligent and then do their additional diligence. In addition to that, you have to do a risk analysis that you have to make it publicly available through a hyperlink. They'll be studying that too. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who will do the more interesting part of talking about how FDA actually implements some of this stuff.
For my portion of the talk, we'll cover some of the requirements that the FDA has for the AI, ML types of software devices. And I'll focus on the machine learning types of software because the content of the 510K or de novo or other submissions, it's much broader. We would have to spend much more time to cover that information. Just briefly rehash some of those guidance documents that Brad has introduced. So there aren't all that many guidance documents, despite the fact that machine learning has been around for some time. The two guidance on the top left, the CAT-E column devices, the content for the submissions, and the some of the considerations for the clinical studies. Those were written back in 2012, I believe. And even though it says that the document was issued in 2022, they just made some minor updates to it. But the guidances were actually issued more than 10 years ago and focused mostly on data, the image analysis types of software, second readers, or in some cases primary reader assisted software. However, the content, the guidance for the pre-market submissions is quite generic. There's a lot of information that actually applies to all types of machine learning software, and FDA frequently cites that that guidance documents for for any types of almost submissions. And I've seen that in pre-subs or requests for additional information for de novo and 510K submissions. So they use that guidance for all types. It will probably take them maybe another few years to write more generic guidance document, which is what the Health Canada actually has done. And that's why I've included that guidance, the draft guidance document for machine learning enabled software. And the Health Canada's guidance is actually a little bit more readable than the FDA guidance documents. And the reason I'm also including that is because both the FDA, Health Canada, and UK's MHRA are working together on putting together some guidance documents and guidelines. And they, as Brad mentioned, they released one in 3 years ago, the guiding principles. There's one more guidance document from the FDA. It's in draft form for software that for machine learning algorithms that can make some updates while are being in use. So typically most of the machine learning algorithms are locked. So once you release them, you cannot change them. You have to go to the FDA first. With this guidance and this approach, now FDA allows some subset of machine learning algorithms to allow them to make changes, but within preset parameters. So there are pretty strict restrictions as far as what kind of types of changes you can make, and those have to be described in detail. What the changes are, what the process for making the changes, and the impact assessment and things like that. So this slide shows in more detail what the content for the submission, what is some of the information that FDA requests. And on the left, it's a list from the guidance document. On the right, the diagram is actually from the Health Canada guidance document. And I like this diagram because it shows kind of a process and a story, and there's an expectation. FDA doesn't explicitly state that, at least not in any particular guidance documents, but in general, that you have to have a process in place, that guides from the designing of your algorithm and the software itself, through the data selection and management. So how you select and manage data, how you annotate it, which databases you use, how they're collected, and so on, through development, training, and evaluation and release of the product. And it's a continuous cycle that even when the product is released, it kind of continues. So for some of the information that FDA wants, the general information. So what is the intended use? Who is going to be using the algorithm, or who's the algorithm for? The clinical context, the disease condition or conditions being treated or diagnosed. Very detailed description of the algorithm, the design and its function, all the models, the classifiers, all the thresholds. If there are multiple methods being used, then each has to be described in detail. Although again, the details of the model, the thresholds, how those were set and developed, what data was used for training, tuning, and then testing all the algorithm. And there is general expectation that your training and your testing and your tuning uses a distinct data sets. Risk management is also an important element, and it's risk assessment is required for pretty much all submissions, especially software submissions. There's no specific requirement for hardware, but generally expected that you provide risk assessment. And so here specifically, there's some types of risks that are identified that each company should evaluate. Things like overfitting of data, underfitting, biased. So biased data that goes back to some of the things Brad mentioned already about making sure that the data is representative of all the users, considering their gender, their age, their socioeconomic background, and so on. And so again, the document, the information that you provide, there's a lot of overlap with other aspects of the submission documentation. There's another guidance for the software content, and so there's some overlap, but FDA actually requests that a lot of that information is provided separately, because when the submission goes in, they divide parts of it and send it to different subject matter experts. So they want to, and they usually have a separate subject matter experts for machine learning. So they want that portion of the documentation being they can easily extract it and send it to these folks. Now, for testing and evaluation, FDA approaches it from kind of, there are two approaches. One is the analysis of and evaluation of the data, as they call it, in the standalone performance data, meaning with it's usually part of software verification and validation. So verifying all those requirements and performance requirements that you define, and some of the information that is required to be included in the submission is the methods used to test or evaluate the machine learning performance, what performance metrics have you chosen, and acceptance criteria. And again, those may be you may set them for each different module, or even different stages of your machine learning algorithm. And again, FDA wants all that information explicitly included in the documentation, because they want to understand all parts of the algorithm. And especially with the problem is that some of the algorithms are pretty complex, so it's almost impossible to describe exactly how they work. So in those cases, you have to try to explain as much as possible. FDA will likely have some questions, but you may have to provide additional. FDA might request more, performance data to support, the algorithm. Comparison with the predicate device. So for 510K submission, it's so Brad mentioned that de novos are pretty, in generally, not bad, but they're much more complex than 510Ks. They require much more data. However, with the 510K, you can provide less data, but I guess the disadvantage is you have to find a good predicate and try to directly compare to that device. So ideally, FDA requests that you either do a side-by-side comparison, so maybe using the same data set on both devices, and if not, maybe use the same criteria and the gold standard that the predicate used to verify the performance. These are some of the examples of the performance tests that were submitted to the FDA, and they have different names for them. But one is comparing conventional machine learning landmark detection. The machine learning software verification is basically part of your V&V testing, internal V&V testing, to make sure that it meets all the specifications and requirements that you define, but also when the software is integrated with the target systems. And there's lists, you can read some of the other items. And some of these actually can be run as part of the clinical study, or you can use clinical data It's generally recommended that. Trying to move to next slide. So there are some cases where you can submit a device without a clinical performance data, but in general, FDA expects that you do provide clinical data because the differences, the technological differences, the differences in the algorithms are significantly different, and also many times even the way the software, how it's used and how it affects the clinician's performance or workflow is significantly different. That FDA wants to see your algorithm being used and being tested in a clinical environment. So the clinical performance testing must demonstrate that the device performs as intended under anticipated conditions of use, and so that's a critical element. The design of your study must mimic almost exactly how the device is going to be used in clinical practice. So again, you have to. So one of the requirements for the submissions, you have to provide the detailed description of the study design, the study endpoints, this study protocol, how the data is collected, who's collecting it, how it's the clinical workflow, and that has to tie back to your design and development of your algorithm that was mentioned earlier. So the clinical study, the study population has to match the population you use for your training and tuning of your data set. And a lot of the information may be, so if you're doing a submission to ARB, which for most cases, most companies have to, or an ID for higher risk, for significant risk devices, a lot of that information can be from those study protocols can be submitted to the FDA, and actually FDA sometimes asks for the actual test study protocol to be included in the submission. And so one more point, FDA requests that you provide justification for almost any decision or any type of aspect of the study. So the study methods, the patient population, the sample size, and all those other critical factors have to be justified and described in the submission.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Much appreciated. We've got a couple of questions, and I think maybe more coming in. So to begin, we had a question around whether, and I guess, Brad, maybe this is for you, but whoever wants to field this around what is and is not regulated by the FDA. Do algorithms which use AI have higher requirements, such as the need for clinical data, compared to similar ones that don't use AI? And so the example here given was the image registration algorithms that don't use AI are often validated with simulated conditions as opposed to clinical use. And so do we see that ones using AI being held to a higher validation standard?
I'm interested in Mike's reaction to this too, but I'll give my 2 cents, which is to say, yes, I think FDA believes that interjects a technological risk that's not well understood, and that's the whole point of clinical validation. Is when you can't necessarily with confidence predict what an additional I'll call it feature. That's not a good use of the word, but an additional aspect of the device that interjects clinical uncertainty needs to be evaluated with clinical evaluation. But Mike, do you want to argue with that or put a finer point on it?
No, actually, what I can do is read a statement from the guidance document, because I think that's the best thing. It's that the agency believes that it could be extremely difficult to demonstrate substantial equivalence between the new or changed device and the predicate device based on indirect comparison because of potential differences in the data sets, reference standards, scoring processes, evaluation methodologies, and so on. So unless you're using the same almost like the same data set, and your algorithm it almost does the same thing, then it's highly unlikely that you can prove the performance without doing some sort of clinical evaluation or data collected from a clinical study. And again, you can sometimes you can do retrospective analysis, but FDA typically prefers you do prospective, because the prospective, that study you design to mimic exactly how the clinical workflow or how the device is used. And so if you use retrospective or some other methods, be prepared to provide justification why that's sufficient.
All right, very good. Well, thank you. Another question here is for those of us who are part of global companies, do you have experience or insights on clinical studies and data being used for de novo submissions that were performed outside the US?
I actually get that question a lot, and not just from global companies, but I get it from startups in Europe that want to take their startup experience in Europe and bring it to the US. And FDA doesn't have a point blank requirement that all studies be conducted in the US, but they do make it very difficult to bring foreign data and rely on it at least substantially. Foreign data can be viewed as confirmatory, but typically there has to be US data. And the reason they argue it is, if you go back to one of those first slides I had with all the different factors that influence how a person responds to care, only 11% is the care itself. Everything else is the genetic makeup of that particular population, the sort of social context in which patients live, patient behaviors. All of that typically could vary considerably from one country to another. And so FDA wants to rule all that out by getting clinical trial data in a US context. So, in theory, you could do it just on foreign data, but you'd have to come up with a really compelling explanation how none of these other factors, genetic differences on average, social differences, social context differences, how none of that could influence the outcome to be expected. And that's an uphill battle. Mike, do you want to add anything to that?
A couple of notes. So the guidance document actually addresses what they call the data poolability, and basically says that you have to provide. She said you have to provide justification for how the data collected in another country is similar in considering all those different factors. But I've seen so typically what's being done in practice is that a foreign company will collect data in different maybe different countries, but in addition to either boost the sample size or to show the relationship between the data sets, they'll do some sort of study in the US. And I have an example here that one of the companies actually did a analysis of US study and the foreign data to demonstrate that there are no differences. And again, as far as sample size, that it will all depend on the type of the study and the product and so on. But that's one of the approach. I don't think I've seen any cases where companies submitted foreign-based data only. There's usually some sort of requirement to at least have some sample. Maybe it could be like as low as 30 or 50 subjects in the US.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you. And by the way, we're going to try to limit questions and move on to the next speaker no later than the top of the hour here. But another question that came in. Our medical device comprises various components, including hardware, software as a medical device, and AI. What approach would you advise for managing complaints and nonconformities? For instance, do you recommend using complaints nonconformity forms for every detected bug, or should this approach be reserved solely for major issues?
Mike, you willing to take that on? I think you have relevant experience.
Yeah, so I guess that depends on how the quality management system is set up. Typically, I consider all non-conformities and as all complaints is just one complaint system. All non-conformities, either depending on the size of the company. For small companies, it's probably more practical to have just one set of one procedure for non-conformities, one form. But if there are different teams with totally different approaches, then maybe having separate the software team typically uses Jira or some other bug tracking tool, so it probably makes sense to use that, whereas hardware team may use either paper-based or some other ERP or some other system. So maybe having separate processes is okay. What's critical is that you have same when you use definition for complaint or non-conformity, you have the same process for investigating them and determining whether you have to take additional action. Especially in terms of medical device reporting and investigating those defects and resolving them. And if it's a significant issue that has to be addressed in the field, then you do the recall or the corrective action, the field corrective action. So that part of the process should be aligned.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Another question that's come in is, in regulatory terms, what are the main criteria to consider an AI feature in a medical device as an accessory?
So there's a guidance document on accessories that FDA published, 4 or 5 years ago. It might have been updated. And they have sort of 3 different criteria. And off the top of my head, I wish I could remember how to say them verbatim. But there are 3 criteria that, for example, are: does the software take the same use and extend it into a slightly different intended use? Or does the software augment or support the function of the parent device? So the parent device and the accessory are linked because the accessory supports it. To give an example of how absurd it can be, they would say that a stand that does nothing more than hold an infusion pump is an accessory. It's just a stick that stands in the air, but it's an accessory because it makes the infusion pump sort of more possible, more portable, and so forth. So they look at that relationship. As I say, there are 3 factors. I wish I could remember them off the top of my head, but you can easily Google that guidance document, and it'll tell you. The difference, just in vocabulary, the difference between an accessory and a component is simply that an accessory is something sold to an end user, where a component is incorporated into the product or with the product, or sold together with the product by the manufacturer. So look at those 2 words in tandem, component and accessory, but there's a guidance document specifically on accessories.
Okay, excellent. And one final question here before we turn it over to Nathan Evans. Can you comment on FDA perspectives on synthetic data, also increasingly called generative data, for use in model training?
It's a complicated topic. I've had various clients ask me about it, and my best understanding of FDA's view is that they're very open to it because they recognize that it provides certain benefits to the ultimate patient, because they're data that can plug holes in the actual data that you have. But they have a set of criteria, again, to make sure that the synthetic data don't reinforce a bias, or that they're directed in a way that skews the results. You basically have to really demonstrate the comparability and utility of the synthetic data. Mike, do you want to add to that?
I think you covered all the information. Again, it's a topic that's probably for another webinar.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Brad. Thank you, Mike, very much. And thank you for all the questions for those of you on the line. And at this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Nathan Evans. Nathan, are you with us? Okay, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks. That was a meaningful topic to start, and I'm switching gears here to a somewhat significant degree, but I do think to some of you out there, I'm hoping this will be helpful. I'm a registered patent attorney and head of the intellectual property group at Woods Rogers, based in Charlottesville, Virginia. I do mostly patents, and this will be about patents. And the bottom line is, you absolutely, assuming that you you're able to overcome the different hurdles at the USPTO that I'm going to talk about today, you can absolutely get a patent on your artificial intelligence or machine learning invention. There's different kinds of IP. We're going to focus today on patents, but of course, if you're a small company, a large company, doesn't matter. You want to protect your IP. There's always trademarks, which will protect your logo, your brand name, things that will protect your business goodwill that you're building. Those are relatively easy and inexpensive to file. You have trade secrets. Trade secrets are interesting in that if you have something that is monetizable and that you take reasonable precautions to protect it, like a non-disclosure agreement amongst your employees, things like that, you can have trade secrets. You don't have to file anything. If you keep them secret, they remain valuable. The problem, of course, is keeping things secret, especially these days with a lot of employee turnover and people jumping from company to company, especially in this industry. And then you also have copyrights, which are interesting in this field in that you can protect your source code using copyrights. I'm not a copyright lawyer. I don't really delve into it often, but there are ways that you can protect that, or maybe your graphical user interface, different things like that. But we're going to focus on patents. And the bottom line is there are two major topics I'm going to cover today. One is, yes, you can protect your AI using patents. And two, to a degree, you can use AI to help you with your AI invention or any invention, but there has to be a significant human contribution, and we're going to get into that today too. But let's dive now into patents and what you can do to get your AI machine learning algorithm, let's say, protected by patents. And patents, I mean, I'm biased a little bit because I am a registered patent attorney, but to me, in some ways in this area, a patent would be the gold standard to protect it. It does give you a limited monopoly for effectively 20 years from when you file your patent application. There are some caveats there, but generally speaking, 20 years from when you file your patent application. The compromise is after 18 months, your patent application does become public. But if you can get protection, then again, you have exclusivity over that algorithm for around 20 years. So you can charge whatever you want and therefore, have an edge in the marketplace, create barrier to entries for competitors, and, have that exclusivity that you can draw upon. But as with any patent, there are hurdles. I'm going to share my screen here and go over some of those. Now, this is a terrible slide. I'm aware of that, but everybody else had a slideshow, so I wouldn't have a slideshow. And maybe this is just to organize my thoughts, and so I don't have to stare at myself on the screen the whole time. But I am going to go through this, so take your time. I only have a very few slides. You can kind of read over this as I discuss the different points. And I will be on the slide for at least 5 minutes or so you have time to read it. But there are three major hurdles, I'll say, for patenting inventions. For the most part, there's two. Your idea has to be novel. It has to be new. Nobody else can have done it before you. Otherwise, you cannot get a patent on that. The other one is non-obviousness. Your idea cannot be obvious. So the USPTO is very good at taking different references that are already in the public domain. So basically what you're up against, so to speak, is what we call prior art, which was anything that was public before you file your patent application. That's sort of what you're judged against. Are you new when you're judged against that in the AI industry? And are you non-obvious? And non-obvious means, well, if you look at this particular published patent application on AI, and you look at this piece of literature on AI, and if you were to read those two together, your idea would be obvious. So those are the sort of hurdles we're looking at. If you take one reference that's out there, is your idea new? Yes. Okay. Well, then you passed the novelty hurdle. What about obvious? Well, we're going to look at what's out there and we're going to piece it together. Would your idea be obvious? Okay. Well, if it's not obvious and it's new, you can get a patent. That's true across the board pretty much for any invention when you're trying to get a patent. But there's another third hurdle that you will come across when you are trying to protect any sort of computer implemented method which is in the field of AI, ML, is your idea patent eligible? And one of the biggest hurdles when you're dealing with the eligibility of protecting your AI invention is whether it's simply an abstract idea. So you cannot get patents on certain things. Certain things are patent ineligible. Laws of nature, mathematical equations, and abstract principles. And that sort of means, effectively, if I could really boil it down to its core, means would a human be able to accomplish this using, for example, a pen and paper? So a lot of times inventors will come to me and they'll say, well, I have created this computer implemented method. And we look at it together and it's like, well, you're basically taking what a doctor or a scientist have been doing for decades, using pen and paper. Or can you use an Excel spreadsheet and the simple features of an Excel spreadsheet to carry out your invention? And if any human could do that, then it's considered an abstract principle. Now, there are ways to overcome that. We're going to talk about that. But that is a big hurdle because I'll give an example. Around 10 years ago, somebody effectively tried to patent hedging risk, but they used a computer. And they said, well, wait a second. Yeah, it's hedging risk, but I'm using a computer. And that doesn't fly anymore. Because basically what people tried to do is sort of throw generic computer functionality into their claim to say, yeah, well, maybe it's hedging risk, but I use a processor and I have a graphical user interface and just these generic terms. And basically the court said, that's an abstract principle. People have been hedging risk for years. And just because you're using computer technology doesn't necessarily make it patentable. So that hedging risk, for example, was considered an abstract principle. So you can see why that might happen in AI sometimes, because it's like, well, we input this information, it's processed like this, and the output is like this. But if it's something that, like, for example, a doctor has been doing for decades, then you might have some issues with abstract principle. Now, there are ways to overcome that. And one of the best ways to overcome that is really to tie the AI invention to a technological improvement, or it transforms the data in some way, which is obviously something that we rely on to argue something's not an abstract principle in AI, because you're transforming input data to output data, which we'll talk about. And basically, if you go in knowing these hurdles, then you can craft your claims. The claims in your patent application are sort of what ultimately you're going to fight with the United States Patent Office about, which is it new? Is it non-obvious? Is it patent eligible? And at the end of the day, what you're going to end up with are claims with different elements. And that's what you can stop others from doing. The patent's not really a right to do anything, but to stop other people. So your claims are going to be, for example, inputting certain information, processing that information. Think of it in terms of active verbs, computer implemented method of training a neural network, comprising, inputting the data, processing that data, outputting that data, which we'll talk about. But if you go in knowing these are your hurdles, you can craft your claim so that, for example, you don't get rejected right off the bat for being patent ineligible abstract principle, because some examiners sort of have a knee-jerk reaction when they see certain AI-related or computer-implemented inventions. Their knee-jerk reaction is, well, let's see if this is an abstract principle, and that's an easy rejection. So we want to go in crafting our claims, knowing that in advance, so that we don't run into that rejection. That's one less thing to worry about during prosecution. So we can try to get you a patent, as fast as possible. Again, assuming that it's new and non-obvious. The other aspect of this that is important is the specification. So that's sort of what really the patent application itself is the specification, but I describe it to my clients a lot of times as the body of the patent application. And really what the specification is in a lot of ways is a dictionary to define the terms that are in your claims. Again, the claims are so critical because ultimately that's what you can stop other people from doing. So it has to be clear exactly that what you are in possession of to stop other people from doing that. And they infringe it if they start practicing every element, which we'll get into. But your specification has to be robust. So basically, again, when I use the term specification, I'm really talking about the body of the patent application, the figures and the definitions that go into defining your claims and construing your claims. So, a large part of this is, because it's sort of new technology, relatively new technology, it's certainly not a widget. We have to take extra efforts to describe your invention. So the sort of the another hurdle is here. You can see on my slide presentation, section 112. It's a statutory section on written description and enablement. That's almost like it certainly is a hurdle, but it's really low hanging fruit. It's almost like 3.5 steps. I mean, this one is critical. It almost goes without saying that you have to sufficiently describe and enable your invention. So basically, and that's difficult in this area, right? So, when a person of skill in the art, somebody in the AI ML industry reads your patent application, basically, if it's an ideal application, they're going to read the specification, they're going to look at the figures, for example, flow charts with different feedbacks, for example. They have to say, okay, I understand what this person believes they have invented. I understand what's going to be input into the neural network, what's going to happen in that black box, which we'll talk about, which is sort of where the magic happens, and then an output. That's sort of how I like to craft my claims. In some cases, input, processing, and then the transformative output. And somebody has to look at that and say, okay, I understand effectively what they believe they have invented. Now let me look at the claims. Okay, the claims say, think of it again in active verbs, inputting, processing, blah, blah. Okay, I understand that they believe that if I practice these steps, I'm infringing. That's sort of an ideal patent application, because a person of ordinary skill in the art can look at it, read it, and understand what you believe to be inventive. So you can, in your specification, have, ad nauseum, algorithmic flow charts going back and forth, showing what's happening in the mysterious black box, the structure of the AI model and how data flows through it. And so, I'll show you an example of this. This was interesting. I was, of course, listening closely to the earlier speakers, but I couldn't help myself, and I was poking around online, and I found at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, which is really a great website, has a lot of helpful features, including all the training that they give to the examiners. So what I love about the USPTO website is I can go on there, and if I'm crafting a certain type of claim, for example, in a certain industry, I can find out the actual guidance that was given to the examiners. You can do the same thing. It's all public information. So I found something I thought you all would find interesting, and I want to show you before I get into sort of my next topic, which is AI assisting with inventions. But let me see if I can share my screen. I'm going off script here, which is dangerous, I know, with technology, but I'm hoping that you can see that. Oh, this is interesting. I went on, there's all these different examples. This is directly from the USPTO. You can see here, it says subject matter eligibility, abstract ideas. So this is what we were talking about, an example of where you might step on a landmine of being rejected for having an abstract idea. This is guidance directly from the USPTO to the examiners, the very examiners that will be looking at your patent application. And I found an example that was really on point here. A method for training a neural network for facial detection. So I will sort of paraphrase. I'm not going to ask you to read these 2 paragraphs, but basically what they came back with was a neural network is a framework of machine learning algorithms. They work closely. They classify this for what a neural network is, what machine learning is, to the examiner, and then they get into what the invention is and how the examiner should think about whether a claim is an abstract principle or not. And so this invention is basically a machine learning algorithm to detect facial images. But basically, it's going to be a training set that's going to be processed, but there's going to be a feedback. And basically, there were, in earlier versions of this hypothetical, there were a lot of false positives saying, oh, well, I recognize a face when there wasn't actually a face. So there's going to be a second set of training material that's going to go into and feedback into the algorithm to improve the outcome. And the question is applying that first training set and then the second training set to continue this process of learning and relearning, is that, and again, and they tell here, some of you will be familiar, with the terminology that are in here, including, the back propagation, for example. So this is using back propagation, which, as most of you know, is sort of a relatively well-known tool for machine learning and AI. And what I thought was interesting was they crafted this claim that I'm going to show you. And this claim was considered not to be an abstract principle and potentially be patentable, again, assuming that it's new and non-obvious. And so this kind of gives you an idea for how you can think about this. Again, the overall takeaway of this is that you can protect your AI invention. And I'm going to sort of end here on a potential claim that you could start thinking about conceptually in your head. Well, okay, can I craft a sentence like this that to describe my algorithm that I believe to be new and non-obvious? And so this is what this did. And this is, again, training directly to the examiners that are going to examine your AI patent application. A computer implemented method of training a neural network for facial detection comprising, okay, collecting a set of digital facial images, okay, applying one or more transformation to each digital facial image, so mirroring, rotating, smoothing, doing some sort of processing on that, creating a first training set comprising the collected set of those images, the modified set of images, and a set of digital non-facial. That's going to be the false positives, which we'll talk about. You train the neural network in the first stage using the first training set, which is those digital images of faces, the collected digital images and modified, created a second training set for a second stage of training comprising the first training set and the non-facial images that were incorrectly detected as facial images. So that's the false positives. And then training the neural network in a second stage using the second. So basically one input in training, second input, second training. And this is what the examiners are told. Yes, the claim recites a series of steps and therefore is a process. If a judicial exception recited, it doesn't say, well, I'm not going to get into that. But the claim was considered not patent ineligible. It doesn't recite any mathematical simulations. Okay, and while some of the limitations may be based on conceptually on that, not recited. It does not recite any mental process, which again, I was telling you about, could a human do this with a pen and pad or with an Excel? It doesn't, because the steps are not practically performed in the human mind. Finally, the claim does not recite any method of organizing human activities, such as fundamental economic concept or interactions between people, which is also patent ineligible. So that claim was considered to be sufficiently described and not an abstract principle. So those are the kind of, if you can walk away knowing that there is IP available for your AI ML inventions, and that you can patent it as long as it's not an abstract principle. And I gave you an example of what is a claim, so you can think conceptually. Could I sort of create a claim like this, and file that with the patent office and possibly get a patent? And the answer is you can do that. So if you have follow-up questions about that, please let Rick know. I've got 11 more minutes. I'm going to leave a little bit of time for a question and answer at the end. But I want to talk about one more subject really quickly, which is using AI to assist your inventions, which is really a different sort of topic, but I'll try to go through it quickly. So let me go back to, again, dangerous here, my slide presentation. Okay. Okay. So this is another, I'm sort of switching gears here a little bit before we get into question and answer. But let's take it from the other side. What if you are using, this is not crazy, and I'm sure you understand. What if you're using AI to help invent your AI invention? I mean, you're in the field, right? It's available to you. What happens if you go to ChatGPT or you go to some other AI and say, well, I'm inventing this and can you help me? Well, there's a step missing here. I'm having trouble with this. What would you do? There's a myriad ways you could use AI to help you invent. And that's actually the hot topic right now. I mean, since the advent of computers, we have in some way, shape, or form had ways to protect computer implemented inventions at the USPTO. And in fact, the USPTO looks at AI computer implemented inventions in much the same way they've looked at any other computer implemented invention. But the hot topic right now is, well, what happens if you heavily rely on AI to build out your invention And what if AI is really, in some ways, the inventor? Well, the bottom line is that AI can, at least in the United States, I can say assuredly at this point, AI cannot be an inventor. You can't say, oh, well, ChatGPT, and me, we're the inventors. That's not how it works. However, the USPTO is doing a great job providing guidance sort of every month and webinars and seminars and continuing education. And this is sort of where we stand now, that patents are available for inventions created with AI assistance, provided a human has made a significant contribution to every element. Inventorship analysis should focus on human contributions as patents function to incentivize and reward human ingenuity. These are things that would not be human ingenuity, just maintaining intellectual domain over an AI system. Merely recognizing the problem and presenting the problem to an AI system does not constitute a significant contribution. But on the other hand, you might be able to show significant contribution by showing that you formulated particular AI engine prompts that were to elicit a particular solution from the AI system. So if that's not subjective enough for you, I don't know what is, but that's sort of why I have a job. And this is the sort of typical thing you can expect from a bureaucracy, although the USPTO actually is pretty amazing in terms of its efficiency. But we're all working this out. So it's not perfect guidance just yet, but we're all working together to kind of help practitioners like me and clients like you understand sort of the fundamentals of it. So it is a little bit, I guess, subjective, but I am now with my clients asking them actively now as part of my SOP when I'm onboarding clients, did you use AI? And to what extent did you use it to invent? And I haven't run into this yet, but if I really felt like AI invented this and there wasn't significant human contribution, I would tell my client, you might be wasting your money filing this because it's not going to be eligible for patent. So what I would say is it's the takeaway I would say is you can use AI to help you build out your invention. But there has to be significant human involvement because, again, that's sort of, this is all, the patent system is complete compromise with the government so that if we jump through certain hoops, the government will provide us with exclusivity for our inventions. And one of these hoops, I guess, in a way, is you have to be a human that invented it. I mean, the patent laws literally were in the Constitution, so I don't think that they envisioned this being an issue, but it's still sort of, we hold true to, the invention has to be a human involvement because because the system is rewarding human ingenuity. But again, you can use AI, and then it just becomes sort of a weighing of was it significant human contribution or was it more of the AI? So interesting that we sort of have been talking about humans in the loop and in the patent system from both sides, from not only from using AI, but also showing that it's not jet. But on the flip side, what is patentable? They're really two different questions, but they are clearly rooted in AI. So that sort of concludes. I had one here about enforcing AI inventions, but I'm not going to get into it. I think it's sort of outside the scope. Of course, if somebody practices every element of your claim, you can put them on notice. There can be a letter writing campaign. There can be lawsuits. There's damages. There's all the things typical for patent infringement. And patents have teeth. If you remember, even Apple got enjoined from importing its watches, I think with a certain oxygen level monitor because another company had it patented. So do you think Apple was thinking, patents are worthless when they were sitting there and all their Apple iWatches were being held, from being imported? Well, I mean, that's just scraping the surface. There's billion-dollar verdicts these days. So your patents can have teeth and you can protect your AI invention. So it's something to consider. So that sort of leaves me with about 5 minutes left. I sort of went over a few different topics and maybe there's some questions out there. I'm sure Rick's been monitoring. So with the last 5 minutes, Rick, why don't you run some questions by me and I'll do my best to answer them. And also, this is my contact information. You can either go through Rick if you want to contact me, or you can email me if you have a question afterwards, or if I can help you, patent your AI invention or whatever it may be. This is my contact information.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Nathan. And for the audience, I'd ask you to please, again, submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And Nathan, I want to, point out this dichotomy between a business professional technologist versus legal. And, we talk about, can you get a patent on something? There's another question that's often not asked, and that is, should you get a patent on something? And so for me, the can question is kind of the first foundational level. But in terms of should you try to get a patent on something, I typically urge people to think about how important is this to your business? Is it something that's a very minor aspect, or is it fundamental to your product? But then also, how discoverable is it? Is it something that you could watch a competitive product in operation and determine that infringement was happening? Then it might become very valuable to patent. If it's something that you would have to reverse engineer, that you'd have to go in and examine source code, then often I tell people to think about maybe just keeping something as a trade secret instead. But I'll stop my editorializing there. I do want to get your perspective on something, Nathan, and that is I often think about AI patentability in terms of being this AI black box in the midst of pre-processing logic and post-processing logic. And so I have often urged people not to simply try to get a patent on the AI technique itself, but rather viewing your AI ML innovation as part of a broader context. Under what circumstances do you provide data to it? What are the trigger conditions? How do you actually invoke this AI? And then what do you do with the outputs of it? My perspective tends to be that this gives you a broader reach. But any comment on that, or any corrections to my advice?
No, I think it's I'm glad you actually brought that up. The black box. I mean, a lot of clients come to me and they're like, well, we have this data, and then we put it into the computer, and magic happens, and then this comes out, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, let's drill down on where the magic is happening. Because I mean, I'm actually sort of surprised by that USPTO guidance. I don't think I would have drafted the claim that broadly, because I think, frankly, that claim was maybe a little bit vague. Now, of course, you would look back at the application and the figures, and it would all make sense, I'm sure. But I like to drill down on that black box, and I like to tease it out. When you input that data and then you output that data, what's the magic that's happening? That's where I like to tease out. Well, this data is being trained by this way. This is the feedback that's happening. This is how the data is being QC'd, or whatever it might be. I like to put in those details. Now, you got to be careful. To your point, you don't want to have a super narrow patent claim with a bunch of elements that's impossible to infringe, because if you change one, maybe you don't infringe. You get to infringe, you have to practice every element of the claim. So you don't want to have too many elements, otherwise it's impossible to infringe. It's not worth the paper it's written on. So I don't want to make it too specific. That's sort of why I have a job in a lot of ways, is in terms of trying to get a broad patent, but not too broad and not too narrow. But I think that goes back to, so that sort of hopefully answers your question a little bit on the black box aspect of it, and also a little bit to the should you do it, right? So there are times where I have, now of course, if I come in and I internally chuckle, I would never chuckle in front of a client, but think to myself, okay, clearly this is ineligible app, or whatever, because either you used AI to do it, or I just think it's probably an abstract principle. I'm like, okay, you could pay me X amount of money to file a patent application, X amount of money to prosecute it, X amount of money to get you an issued patent. But at the end of the day, is it going to be so narrow that it makes no sense? Is it better to keep it as a trade secret? Do you only have two founders, and the black box and what's in the black box, and you two would never let it out, and no one can reverse engineer it? Well, that's best as a trade secret. So I would guide you in that regard when you came in about the different types of IP, the costs involved, and whether you should or should not patent it.
Wonderful. Great advice. And I see no other questions, if I'm reading this correctly. So, and with an eye on the clock, I would say simply thank you, Nathan. And for everyone, this concludes today's webinar. Please remember that tomorrow we'll meet during this same time to discuss 2 additional topics: complying with existing privacy regulations when training AI models using patient data, and best data management practices for AI with an emphasis on reducing the risk of bias. If your question was not answered, or if you'd like more information, please visit our website at fussfoundation.org. That's FUSfoundation.org, or email us at info@fussfoundation.org. So thank you for joining today. We look forward to continuing this discussion tomorrow, and goodbye for now.